Welcome to Proving the Point, where we discuss important research papers that you should know about. Today, we're going to talk about this paper called Prenatal Stress Feminizes and Demasculinizes the Behavior of Males. And so what they did in this paper is they took pregnant rats and they subjected them to psychological stress, and then they looked to see what effect this would have on the behavior of the offspring. Specifically, they looked at the male offspring, and what they found is that prenatal stress, which again, that's just stress during pregnancy, prenatal stress basically caused those males to have altered sexual behavior. They were less willing to copulate with female rats and more willing to copulate with other male rats. So it was basically inducing homosexual behavior in these rats. Now, the reason that this is important is because in human societies, specifically in the West and in developed societies more generally, there's been a massive increase in LGBT behavior and identity. So things like homosexuality and transgender identity. These are increasing rapidly in these societies, and there's a big debate about what's causing this. Okay, so some people think it's caused by genetic factors. That seems unlikely, given that it takes a long time for like a genetic mutation to spread in a population. What's more likely is environmental factors or even social factors, which are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Okay, the increase in LGBT behavior could be explained by multiple things simultaneously. So other explanations for the increase in LGBT behavior is one, as we're going to talk about today, prenatal stress. So pregnant women are stressed more than ever before because they have to have a career instead of just staying at home. And there's a lot more pressure on women than before. There's also the explanation of social contagion, which is the idea where basically LGBT behavior is considered somewhat of a social fad, where it's popular in certain contexts, like maybe in very liberal areas. You will gain social benefits if you identify as LGBT. Other explanations are things like endocrine disruptors. So a lot of chemical toxins in our environment, they disrupt our hormones like testosterone and estrogen, and that can alter the sexual behavior and even identity of the individual. So probably all of these things are true. As it relates to things like homosexuality, I think a significant portion of it is genuine. So in other words, some of it is probably social, but I think a lot of it is biological, where people are born with certain hormonal predispositions that lead them to these behaviors. Okay, now this is important because it also has implications for how we address this. So in terms of why we need to address the increase in LGBT behavior, the reason is because it's suppressing our fertility rates. So we talked about this in a previous video, but Western societies, and again, many advanced societies in general, they have sub-replacement fertility rates where it's well below the levels needed to replace the people who are dying in those societies. So basically, we're not having enough kids to replace those who die. And this is causing a lot of economic problems because we don't have enough laborers, young laborers, to support our population. And therefore, our governments are trying to boost our economies by importing foreign laborers. Okay, so they're bringing in migrants in mass, and mass immigration is causing a lot of problems. It's causing serious cultural conflict. Okay, it's causing decline in religiosity. It's causing decline in trust. We've talked about that in a previous video too, but diversity, specifically ethnic diversity, is very, very bad for a society for many different reasons. Okay, so if we're going to stop the diversification of Western society, which is what we have to do if we're going to save our civilization, then we need to boost our fertility rates, either that or just endure the economic hit associated with declining fertility. And if we're going to increase our fertility rates, we need to figure out what's causing LGBT behavior and try to address the root cause. Okay, now this, just to qualify this doesn't mean that we need to get rid of LGBT people, okay? I think what papers like this actually show is that they have a genuine biological phenomenon underlying their behavior, okay? It's not truly social in every case, and a lot of these people, they are born predisposed to having these inclinations and behaviors, And I think if we're going to address it, really you got to start by the root cause, which means addressing things like prenatal stress or exposure to endocrine disruptors. I think that's the path forward. It's not so much trying to retroactively change the sexual orientation or even gender identity of people today. It's about identifying the root cause and then addressing those root causes so that the people of tomorrow have a lower rates of these behaviors. Okay. So I think that's the path forward regarding how to solve LGBT issues. Okay, so now we're going to get into the paper. They start off by talking about how androgens, which is basically male hormones, underlie male sexual behavior in rats, which is not surprising. Okay, they say if you prevent males from having androgens by blocking it or by castrating them, then they're less likely to go on to engage in male typical sexual behavior, and they're more likely to engage in female typical sexual behavior. So less copulation with females and more likely to engage in what's called female lordotic posture. So lordosis, that's basically whenever an organism arches its back in a submissive sexual posture. Okay, so these males are more likely to do that if they've been deprived of androgens. So the opposite is also true. So if you look at females, if you give them androgens early on in their development, that basically causes male-like sexual behavior. Okay, so while this paper mostly focuses on males, it's the case that both in males and in females, messing with their sex hormones can alter their sexual behavior. Okay. Well, one thing that influences their sex hormones, as it says down here, is exposure to stress. That's psychological stress. So in the case of rats, that includes things like shock avoidance. So if you shock these animals, it causes stress, which alters their sexual hormones. An important one that also applies to humans is living in overpopulated colonies. Okay. So when the rats are overpopulated, that basically causes greater psychological stress, which might be inducing homosexuality in their offspring, which might be suppressing their fertility rate. Okay, so the authors later at the end of this, they speculate that maybe this stress-induced induction of homosexuality is adaptive for the population because by suppressing the fertility rate, specifically when the colony is overpopulated, that might help balance out the population more. Okay, this has important implications for humans because, again, overpopulation, overcrowding, that impacts fertility in humans too. And humans, of course, are moving from rural areas, which are not very populated, to highly populated urban areas. Okay. And urban areas have lower fertility rates and they also have higher stress rates. Okay. And higher LGBT identification rates. So there might be something to the idea that when everybody's moving to cities, things are overcrowded, things are overpopulated. That's causing stress in people. That's inducing homosexuality in people, which is suppressing the fertility as sort of like an attempted correction at the overpopulation. Okay, so that one's kind of interesting. But the point is, various psychological stressors can suppress and alter androgen levels. And again, while they're talking about rats, that applies to humans also. All right, so later on, they give their main hypothesis for this paper, which is, okay, well, if androgens are important for male sexual behavior and stress alters androgen levels, then stress should alter male behavior and should basically make it more feminine. Okay, so to test this, what they did is they took pregnant rats, like I said, and they had 4 groups. So one group, the pregnant rats were not exposed to stress and neither were their offspring. So that was the control group. In another group, the pregnant rats were stressed during pregnancy, but their male offspring were not. In another group, the pregnant rats were not stressed, but their offspring were. And then in the last group, the pregnant rats were stressed and the offspring were stressed. Okay, so those are the 4 groups. The way that they stressed them is basically they restrained them for 45 minutes, several times a day. And the restraint, the physical restraint, stresses them out. Okay. So Then after that, they let the male rats grow up, and then they tested their sexual behavior. So we're going to go now to the results. So what they found is if you put these male rats from these different groups in with basically breeding females, you can look to see how often the male rats copulate with the females. That's basically insert their penis into the female, and how often they ejaculate into the female, okay? So if you look at the control offspring, so this is the group that they were not stressed prenatally or postnatally, so not during pregnancy or after they were born, okay? If you look at the percent of those that ejaculated and copulated with the females, it's significantly higher than these groups down here. Okay, so if you look at the group below, the next row down, the postnatal stress group, these are males that were stressed only after they were born. Okay, you see that they ejaculated and copulated at a slightly lower frequency than those who were not stressed. Okay, so even early life stress after you're born, that seems to impact at least slightly reproductive behavior and sexual behavior. Okay, if you look at the next row down, this is the most important one for this study. These are male offspring of prenatally stressed individuals. In other words, their mother was stressed during pregnancy, but they were not stressed in early life. Okay, they had a very low percentage of those ejaculated or copulated with the females. Okay, so massively suppressed male typical sexual behavior in the prenatally stressed males. And then this last row down, the pre and postnatal stressed individuals, so they were stressed during pregnancy and in early life, they also had low rates of ejaculation and copulation with females. Okay, so as they say over here, for the most part, the prenatally stressed groups simply did not attempt to copulate. So they're basically sexually suppressed. They're not interested in the female rats. Okay, the next experiment they did is they wanted to see, okay, so these males, they're not interested in female rats. Are they interested in male rats? So what they did is they took those males and they castrated them. So that was done to basically suppress any remaining testosterone. And they injected them with estrogen and progesterone to basically see, are these rats basically more susceptible to behaving as females sexually? Okay, so then what they did is they put them in with males and basically tested to see if they would act as receptive females. Okay, so those results are down here. So again, this first row, that's the control individuals. So they weren't stressed prenatally or postnatally. And this is showing how many times they engaged in lordotic responses. Again, that's basically, do they adopt a female sexually submissive posture in the presence of males? And it wasn't very often. Okay, so they were receptive to these males. That means basically sexually submissive to these males 36% of the time. Okay, the group that was exposed to postnatal stress, they were receptive 53% of the time. The group that was prenatally stressed, they were receptive 73% of the time, and they had much higher lordotic responses. The group that was pre and postnatally stressed, they had receptive responses 88% of the time. So what this tells you is that early life stress, one, it reduces their willingness to engage sexually with female rats, and two, it increases their willingness to engage sexually with male rats. Okay, so just to skip ahead to the conclusions. Okay, what's interesting is this is kind of what I was saying before, where they talk about how under normal circumstances, the pregnant rats would not be stressed. So if they're in like a favorable environment, therefore they would produce males that are sexually normal, meaning they're pursuing females. Okay, but it says under a variety of unfavorable environmental conditions, which have in common the ability to activate the adrenal cortical responses to stressors, that basically just means they're stressed and they're having these adrenaline responses, which suppresses testosterone. The normal amount and ratio of testicular to adrenal androgen is altered, and along with it, the relative potency of androgenic stimuli under which the tissues mediating sexual behavior differentiate. In other words, they're stressed. That alters their sexual development. And the part that's really interesting is they say the resulting alterations in sexual behavior, basically inducing homosexuality, provide the basis for an effective population control mechanism, since offspring so affected would not possess the behavioral repertoire necessary to contribute to the population growth. So, the idea here is that when a population gets overgrown, such that there's limited resources and overcrowding and too much competition, that's very stressful. What that does in the pregnant rats is it causes suppression of androgens, which cause feminization of the male rats, male offspring, which then causes homosexuality, which reduces fertility of the population, which then reduces overpopulation and sort of corrects. Okay, so again, I think maybe one of the reasons we have an increase in LGBT behavior in our society, because one, we're more stressed than before, and this is in part due to overcrowding. So people are moving into overcrowded urban centers where it seems like there's not enough room, there's not enough space. And so their biology is wired to respond to this by decreasing the desire to reproduce, by basically inducing homosexuality. Okay. So that's all there really is to say about this paper. The main point is that prenatal stress seems to be a major cause of homosexuality in these rats. And this likely applies to humans. Maybe in a future video, we'll cover a study on prenatal stress in humans and its effect on sexual orientation. But again, the main point is just that if we're going to try and minimize homosexuality or LGBT behavior more generally, then we need to be targeting the root cause, because this is genuinely, in many cases, this is caused by a biological predisposition, which can be caused by, among other things, stress early on in life or even prenatally. So the real strategy to address that is to address the root cause. So we need to make our population less stressed. And again, the interesting takeaway from this study is the author's speculation at the end that this might be a population control mechanism. So when a population becomes overcrowded, whenever it reaches its environment's carrying capacity, resources become scarce, they become overcrowded, and there's excessive competition for limited resources, and all that causes stress in the remaining individuals. And stress, it almost seems, is designed to suppress androgens, which is then inducing homosexuality, which then reduces the fertility rate, which then brings the population back to a more balanced level. So it might be sort of a population self-corrective mechanism. So that's also something to consider and be aware of. But that's it for this paper, so thanks for listening.